Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here today. So, as Johnny said, my job at I still struggle to remember what we are called now, Reach, is that is to make sure that our audience keeps growing and that we are growing the right sort of audience, i.e. getting people to come back to our sites more often. The brief for the presentation today is quite broad, so apologies if I take us down some blind alleys. At least there's some very vivid slides to look at if I do. I wanted to talk about the transformation of the regional press from the perspective, I guess from my perspective. I've been involved in projects to deal with the challenges the industry's faced for about 10 years. If you go on to Hold the Front Page, you'll see me invariably described as a faceless suit and things like that by the commentators. What I'd always try to do is try and explain why we're doing what we're doing. That does sometimes result in some interesting conversations on Twitter, so hopefully you'll get a sense from what I'm showing today. It's less our corporate belief, more where I hope and think the industry is going. Want to look at where we started, where we are today, what our philosophy is now, hopefully how we can bridge the divide between journalism, academia and the day-to-day activities in our newsrooms. It's not uncommon, of course, for those trying to run newsrooms to clash with those who are often researching what we do, but hopefully if there's one thing that we can agree on is that journalism's always been full of opinion, and I've tried to make sure this deck is full of plenty of opinion. Hopefully the presentation today with its name, Them and Us, will give some sort of ideas as to how potentially we could work together in the future. But I thought, so that's the stuff I'm hoping to cover off today. But we shall start, I think, with a copy of the Birmingham Evening Mail from April 1999. I've read it several times recently, and this edition of the Birmingham Mail probably falls into the category of rainy day edition. It's solid enough, it does its job well, it ticks all the boxes for a newspaper from 1999. I suspect it would never have troubled the editor's stash of possible award entries when he gathered those up at the end of the week. The reason I put it up today, or the reason I found it rather, is I was cleaning out my mum and dad's house recently. I'm sure many of you have been through a similar process, and it's one of those processes that's full of, which is quite painful, but also quite rewarding with the things that you find, the memories that you uncover. My mum and dad's house was full of boxes of newspapers, which you probably would expect for the parents of a journalist, a print journalist. Sadly, most of them were my mum's. She was a huge royalist, so she had a copy of every paper from the day Charles and Diana got married, and every paper as well from the morning that Diana died. She also has a copy of my brother's only work of fiction that he's published to date, along with a note that she received from one of her friends saying it must be lovely to have a son who's now published, which, having had 10 years in journalism at that point, it has to be said, grated somewhat. Anyway, there's another stack of boxes in my house as well of newspaper cuttings, some of which I'm very proud of, others of which were there for the NCTJ to prove that I had indeed covered my obligatory industrial tribunal for the logbook. Anyway, back to this copy of the Mail. There was no real obvious reason for it to be in my parents' house. Both my parents were from the Midlands. But I went through it 3 times, 56-page paper, and what I realised was that my nan's death notice was in there, so sort of 20-odd years on. It's still around in our house. And I guess with this presentation in mind, it was a sharp reminder that newspapers were bought for more than just news, and were about much more than just providing news to people. We all know that we get more complaints about getting the TV listings wrong or getting the Sudoku wrong. And I remember one of the first jobs I did in a group role at Trinity Mirror was to work on a project to remove TV Plus listings from our papers on the grounds that, well, nobody ever uses them, and boy did we learn the otherwise when we took them out again. So, as I said, pretty typical newspaper, did everything you'd expect the newspaper to do. It had the latest national news in it, it had a high story count, it had a daily poll in it. People rang a premium rate number to give their view on something. This was 1999, the days before the internet, I guess, had become a real threat for local news, or so we thought. However, this perfectly good copy of the Evening Mail was already selling fewer copies than this edition of the Mail would have done 5 years previously and 10 years previously. And maybe the front page gives us a bit of a clue to sort of the challenges that we were to face, because if you look at the top, you can see there's a blurb which heralds the arrival of a new lifestyle section Was it a sign that the paper was already feeling the need to try and diversify and find new readers? I wasn't in daily newspapers in '99. I was still working on weeklies. I moved into daily newspapers into 2000, and almost straight away was hearing those sorts of conversations. I guess what we know with hindsight is that even back in 1999 with papers like this, which the reason for showing it is I think it ticks all the boxes of what we'd expect an evening newspaper to be, is that we were dealing with an unescapable truth which has only become apparent over time, and that's that a local journalist's belief in the importance of local journalism is often much stronger than a local person's belief in the importance of local journalism. And that's the challenge that we grapple with today in the newsrooms that I've worked in for over 10 years now, and this is how our transformation has panned out over the last 10 years. I won't go through every box in detail. Obviously, pre-2003, we had print newsrooms because that's what we'd always done. 2003, we started dabbling with the internet, and then anybody who's working in newsrooms around about that time will be it NewsQuest, Trinity or Johnson, will remember suddenly that the internet was bad and we all stopped doing it because there was no money there. But we kept adapting with that. Trinity Mirror went through a phase of giving newsrooms peculiar numerical numbers. Newsroom 3.0, which was an internal joke that made it onto a press release, and thus something was born. It was the point at which we tried to give digital content equal weight to print, greater focus on digital skills, and that's when our analytics became part of daily life. 3.1 in 2013, that was the first one I led. Content teams became digital first. A lot of new digital roles created in the newsrooms. We really started focusing on local audience growth because page views uniques were brilliant, but how many people were really accessing us locally? 2015, we went audience first. Newsrooms fully driven by data analytics, and we had what's called the 4I content strategy, which is every piece of content either needs to give instant information, inspire readers, involve readers, or influence readers. And then last year in Birmingham, we launched the first of our live newsrooms, which are digital-only newsrooms with a small print newsroom alongside. If I look back now, it's possible to argue that we were too slow to change. For too long, we believe changing our content or changing the design of our content would stem the decline of newspaper sales. Then we went through a spell of believing we could hold back the tide of the internet by just putting up 5 or 6 stories a day, urging people to step away from their desktop computer, pop on their coat, pop down the shops and buy the newspaper if they wanted to see the full story. It never worked. We might smile or grimace at that in hindsight, but there was a sound if slightly short-sighted business logic there, because the money was in print, and the money therefore would stay in print if we didn't put the content online. It took us a long time to realise we weren't in control anymore. What actually happened was that other people put the content online for us. Football forums started uploading our back pages, local forums started sharing our headlines, and then Mark Zuckerberg, in his spare time during his degree in America, gave us Facebook, which enabled people to share news directly between one another, and they didn't need us at all. So in many ways, much of the work that I show on this slide here is us being playing catch-up with what should have been happening a decade ago, and realising that the days of the local news being a 30-minute fixture over the lunch table in the canteen at work or in your armchair in the evening were behind us. I guess if there's one thing that's changed more than anything else, it's not the platforms, it's not the readers, it's not the journalists, it's the fact that every single story now has to stand or fall by its own merits, and that has a profound implication for our journalism and the skills we need journalists entering the profession to have if we're to survive and grow together. So this is what our newsrooms are built around now, and I'm sure you all agree that the best way to articulate the importance of local journalism is through a Venn diagram. On one hand, we're not afraid to celebrate content that's well read. I'm probably only about 10 minutes into this presentation before we started talking about clickbait, but in many ways the notion of clickbait is as lazy as when people shouted tabloid journalism at us in the 90s. Content written to be read, constructed to be read, and prompted to be read is not clickbait if it delivers what the reader expects. If it misleads the reader into it, they won't come back. That's a short-sighted journalism strategy, is giving away free knickknacks with the local evening newspaper in Morrison's. There's also a degree of hypocrisy, I think, when we talk about clickbait, and the clickbait comes up far too often. Many of the titles I work with will run spoiler articles about soaps, and we'll post it on Facebook. And then people will say, slow news day or clickbait, or we'll give a list of the Netflix previews. on Somerset Live, which will generate about 3% of the our readership from Somerset will read that. Yeah, if you go back to that Birmingham Evening Mail from April 1999, there were locally written TV previews for that day's telly. There was an interview with Elvis Costello done locally. The idea that local can only do local seems to be a relatively new construct that we're pushing back against. So, as you might expect, data plays an important part in this Venn diagram, which I'll come back to it in a minute. Our basic belief is that if it matters to our readers, and we learn that through data, then it should matter to us. So that they know they should care about the things which matter to us. In other words, if something's important, it's worth us making the effort to have the relationship with the reader so they appreciate it's important. People don't know there's going to be a big problem with the bins and don't go looking out for stories about big problems with the bins. We need to have the relationship with them to tell them when there's a big problem with the bins, they come to us for it. So what we have here is down the right-hand side of the stories, which digitally work really well for us. We probably do more of them than we used to. So you can see that we do far more shopping stories than we used to. That is there is about what's on for children, not animal cruelty. And then more weather stories than ever before, and a lot of animal stories. And these are the things that probably often journalists will go, it's not journalism, readers want it, so we do it well. Down the middle is the stuff that I think we as journalists would always appreciate as journalism, but the readers also really value as well. Football, content, crime. The digital data is proving every marketing study in regional newsrooms that showed readers don't want crime is wrong. Court and national and world news really works for our sites, particularly those that are have really engaged audiences. And down here on the left-hand side is the stuff which we need to work on to get to audiences, but we still think is very important. So you've got your big idea, set-piece investigations, education, health, and the long reads at the bottom, some of which I'll touch on in a bit. The challenge for the content down the left-hand side is to make it popular. It's never going to compete with a cute dog story or a transfer rumour in terms of absolute page views, but that shouldn't be a reason not to do it. Equally, it shouldn't be a reason not to try and make it well read, and that's sometimes where we go wrong. So some of the big pieces we're most proud of over the past few years, Liverpool Echo's Hillsborough coverage, live blogged every minute of every day of that. It had in excess, even on a quiet day when there wasn't much happening, of 30,000 people reading it at any one time. People spent on average 45 minutes a day reading that because we found a way to tell that story. Birmingham Live, as it is now, has done some fantastic work about homelessness, not just telling the story of homelessness, but telling the stories of the individuals who are homeless, and there's been a huge response to that. And the Manchester Evening News Spice investigation was a video-led piece of content that led you into a really important piece of work. Why is all of this important? Well, because with audience comes conversation, and from conversation comes reaction. Back in 2000, I could get away with hiding a bog-standard council story as a mid-book page lead in the Lancashire Evening Telegraph, and it was a job well done because I'd filled a mid-book page lead. In our newsrooms now, every journalist is expected to look at a story, ask themselves who their target readers are and how they're going to get the story to them. Put simply, it's not enough anymore for us to say something's important, therefore we write it. The job isn't done when we press publish. That's only the start of the job. The next part of the job is to get the story out to people. So this means a journalist in our newsroom is expected to be, first of all, safe. We have to be able to trust their work the moment they come into the newsroom. And the second thing we need all of our journalists to be is social. Sociable is optional, but social is very, very important. In other words, they need to be capable of bringing an audience to their story, be that through the way they tell it, or the way that they promote it. So our experience is that journalism schools generally very good at delivering on the first part. However, on the second part, when we say to people, how would you get stories to readers, far too often the answer we get is, well, I do have a Twitter account, and it's kind of. We need journalists who are arriving in our newsrooms who show how they can build an audience up very quickly, not dissimilar to the conversation we had about sources a little bit further before. And then there's a third part that we find our journalists are increasingly into, and that is revenue. They're not just interested in revenue. Many of our journalists are obsessed by it, and why not? It's the thing that keeps us in work. The indifference in revenue declined from years gone by where we would sort of heckle sales reps if they came onto the newsroom floor, has been replaced by a determination to do what we can to help make money in the business. Pretty much every journalism student that I meet can tell me about the decline in newspaper revenue, and as as we were just talking about before, the Cairncross Review has reminded us of that this morning. But very few can talk about how digital journalism can be funded now. And that strikes me as odd because in local news at least, the correlation between readers and revenue has never been closer. It's one of the reasons why we launched Belfast Live. That's a profitable news website. And we've done the same in Glasgow, Dublin and now Leeds. We're not seeking to take away Johnston Press's revenue or independent newspaper Northern Ireland's revenue. We believe that through connecting with readers, we can provide an additional service and create a new relationship with readers. The relationship which Belfast Live has with its readers through the Facebook Messenger inbox would be the envy of any bricks and mortar high street newsroom in the country. These days, the very art of writing a story which people want to read helps determine the revenue which a newsroom can make. It's empowering, but also fraught with risk. Quite often I'll see our editors defending the charges of clickbait. More often than not, what we actually see within that is an editor who's acutely aware of their ability to drive revenue, to sustain journalism, and making daily judgment calls about the things that will drive audiences quickly and help us sustain the journalism that takes a little bit longer to grow. When you're inside the industry, some of the debates that we see from within academia can be baffling. So if you take the regulatory discussion we hear about stories about Greggs the Bakers, yes, we probably do write more stories about Greggs the Bakers than we did in the past, but we don't write more stories about food and drink than we did in the past. If people want to read it, and we can apply the art of journalism to and the sharing of information to that, we will do. It's part of a mix, that's all. Nowhere in the company have we sacked a business reporter to bring in a Greggs correspondent. Although that is sometimes how it feels from the conversations we see that we're subject to. Some of you will remember the story of the KFC meal in Gloucestershire. It was a reporter who saw it dumped in the street on his way to work, and I consider it a victory that he considered to take a photo of it, because Johnny will remember in 2008 when I was in the Birmingham Mail, the very notion of getting a reporter to take a picture when they saw something was utterly alien. So if we've achieved anything in 8 years, it's the fact that we now take the photos. But joking aside, the reporter turned it into a few parts online, a kind of talking point, look at the mess somebody's left in the street, and it went viral, as they say. I'd love to be able to say that I work in newsrooms that are capable of knowing something will go viral, but I don't. We know many of the ingredients, but a little bit like the Colonel's secret formula, there's some unknown fickle finger of fate which plays a part there as well. Nothing screams failure more than the story that's written to go viral. Anyway, back to the chip story. It's become the stuff of folklore, a case study in the debasing of regional journalism and the quest of clicks for some. And yes, the great team in Gloucestershire did milk it for all it's worth when it started being picked up by the USA Today and the New York Times. But here's the thing that most people don't know about this story. The chap whose KFC it was came forward and said sorry. He was then fined by the council. He used it to make a point about littering in general. So what started off with just a piece of light-hearted content, the reporter spent 5 minutes on it, just thought it'll be a talking point, then actually became a piece of civic journalism with a reaction purely because it was a piece of journalism that got people talking. If anything, it kind of tells us a lot more than the initial sort of commentary around it. It's the readiness of our teams to engage with what people want and talk about, which helps us to reconnect with the readers in a way that means we're not only there when the M5 is shut, when a school closes due to snow, or when there's been a murder down the street. We need to be more than the old Yellow Pages thing of not just there for the nasty things in life. If anything, the rainy day editions of 1999 have become incredibly important to us in 2018 because those rainy days need to become reader days every day. Not relying on big news, not relying on Facebook's algorithm, not relying on a search spike to get readers through the door. And this is our challenge presented in our new corporate colours. The graph shows how readers got to page views on one of the sites that I work with. So you can see that on this particular site, about 35% of the page views are generated by social, another 30-ish% by search. There's about 23% in there are internal, so anybody who went on to commit a second page view, if I make that sound like a crime, I don't know, they will go on to a second page view in there. Direct is about 10% and external on this particular site, so that's Judge Report, football forums, football clubs, and so on. Despite the Facebook algorithm changes, social is still a prominent source of traffic, as you can see there, followed by search. Now, it's easy to dismiss search and social as fly-by-night click chasing, But when we look at the data, the active engaged time for articles, so the time people actually spend moving down the page or watching a video, is far highest for the search readers. They read fewer pages, but they actually spend more time on a specific article. It's kind of obvious if you think about it. They're looking for something, we're serving it up. If you search for Coronation Street spoilers and you land on the MEN's Coronation Street spoilers article, you're going to read it to the end if it's done well. So that's search readers. Social readers, however, spend less time on articles, but social is a huge source of loyal readers to our site. So this is where the loyal page views come from. These are from the readers who visit us every day. What we find through social is if you get the stories right, people make a connection and they'll return to you. Facebook's algorithm change was about giving people more of what they wanted and less of the kind of chancy type stories they might want. Loyal visits from Facebook to our sites have not gone down as a result of Facebook's algorithm change. Overall traffic from Facebook has, but the loyal visitors are still coming through. That does suggest, and it pains me to say this, that Facebook's algorithm change has worked. And a good example of this was the Manchester Evening News has a fantastic relationship with its social readers. And so that when they pushed out a 9,000-word article looking in the background of the guy who blew up the Manchester Evening News arena, it was by far and away the most read thing across the Trinity Mirror network as it was then for a week from social, because the MEM was able to say, listen, this is 9,000 words, trust us, we think it's very, very important. But more than ever, we have to we look at direct visitors, and you can see that's quite a small proportion for us now, although it's still in absolute terms, it'll be bigger than sort of newspaper circulations locally for the last 20 years or so. But we also want to look at the internal referrals now. So it's relatively easy to get people on site. How do you get the people to stay? How do we repeat that? And here's another stat that you might be familiar with. At Reach, we now use Chartbeat, or have used Chartbeat for a number of years, and it measures quality page views, so the ones that last for more than 15 seconds. And what this shows is about 45% of page views on the Chartbeat network, so beyond just us, last for less than 15 seconds. So people go on, that could be them browsing a section front, the homepage, or whatever. But a lot of people are just making that judgment, no, that's not what I thought it was, and they either move on to the next page or leave the site. It's scary to a certain extent, but every story has to stand or fall by its own merits, and every journalist needs to know how to keep people on the story. The truth about clickbait is that it doesn't work, mainly because people have got wise to it. So mentally, readers have a clickbait filter. When they click on an article, they're thinking to themselves, is this stacking up with what I expect it to be? If they're a loyal visitor, they probably don't have that filter because they trust the site. First appearances really matter. And when you have an ad-funded model like ours, which is my proxy for, yes, I'm aware that there's quite a lot of adverts on our websites, it's more important than ever that the content sings that when you land on it. We have seconds to hook people in, and this is a skill that we need to be teaching. Most of the newsrooms I work with do headline testing, pushing out a story with up to 8 different headlines on it, and for 30 minutes it's tested by Chartbeat on our network, and then it'll deliver a result like this. So this is from the Manchester Evening News, and it's about a woman who was found dead 20 years ago, and the police had announced a £50,000 reward to catch her killer. And the winner, as Chartbeat put it, was the story that got a click-through rate of 7.8%. So 7% of people who landed on the homepage were clicking on the article with a quality click rate of 54%. So 54% of the readers to that article were then going on to spend more than 15 seconds on it. The one above it wasn't the winner, but actually had a higher quality click percentage. So this is real-time data that our newsrooms work with, and we're resetting our gut instinct on what works as we go along. It challenges decade-old dilemmas, locality in the headline or not, quotes in the headline or not, questions in headlines or not, and so on. And I'm glad that I work with journalists who are ready to reset their gut instincts. So how are we faring in this new world as a company that's predominantly made up of regional publications? Well, things could always be better, but we're in a much better place than we could have been. We've more local readers on our titles than at any point in the last 30 years. And that means we have a greater voice too. So police forces now complain to us if we don't run their missing from homes within an hour on our Facebook pages, because they rely on our Facebook pages more times than not for missing from homes to be found. Most of the titles I work with in Reach actually indeed reach 15% of their local audience every day. And for any of you who are familiar with the ex-local world newsrooms, that was one of the first things we focused on when we started working with titles there, was moving away from just headline unique users, focusing much more on the local audience. It may just be, many of these newsrooms reach 50% of the population a week. It might just be one story a week, but it's starting to build that reconnection that we need to build on. And of course, that brings us to page views. Page views are often demonised as the fault of everything that's wrong with journalism. They're no more a blight on journalism than the daily focus on newspaper sales became in the early 2000s when sales were going backwards. Like all metrics, if you treat anyone in isolation, you go wrong quickly. But used smartly, you get closer to your readers. So we use this suite of metrics, or we'll be doing from next month, which starts with the bedrock of new users, returning users and loyal users, so we don't just care about our just a unique user number, but just having the users isn't enough. So we expect our content editors, and this data is instant for them, and if you spend time in any of our newsrooms, you'll see our newsrooms are making instant judgments on this data all the time. We're interested in the pages per session, so once people are on the site, how long are we keeping them for? On articles, what's the recirculation rate? So what's the likelihood of somebody going on to the next page? Brilliant yesterday. Manchester Evening News had one of its best days of the year on the back of the Saddleworth Moorfire. 23% of people who landed on the live blog of it went on to another page, which is a really good result. We track internal page views as well. So which are the stories that are getting the most internal page views? What interests people once they're on the site? The active engaged time, so how long are people spending average with it? Social interactions, that's a really important metric. And then that gives us the three metrics which hopefully keep the roof on the house, and that's page views, because obviously the revenue comes from that, video streams, because the revenue comes from that, and high impact stories, because that keeps people interested in what's going on in our newsrooms. So I talked about high impact stories there as well, and this is our most experimental of metrics. It's actually a combination of metrics. To be high impact, a story has to reach at least 5,000 people, and those people be engaged for, on average, more than a minute. The average story on our network holds people for 33 seconds. Every month, our regional titles do about 2,000 high impact stories, and the examples I've got here show what a mix of stories they are. So at the bottom, one from Kent here, it's the newest restaurants that have been rated by the people who've actually eaten there, essentially crowdsourcing restaurant reviews. The Belgrave Middleway crash, live coverage of the inquest into the crash just before Christmas that killed 6 people, and a piece from Football London, one of our new websites, which was the long read background on how Maurizio Pochettino came to sign a new contract. Each of those stories are written in very unconventional ways that help engage readers. We learn from that and then build on that for the next month. It would be really easy to dismiss this metric as a vanity one for journalists who want to inflect a value on stories that otherwise don't just deliver page views. I've seen some cynics, because we're trying to share this on Twitter every month to see what the reaction is, say that it proves that it only proves what we always knew about journalism. I've seen it used as an argument for why we were wrong to disband feature desks. Writing long, we've learned, doesn't guarantee high impact. Knowing what keeps an audience on a story does. So why does high impact matter? Because it shows that we're holding people's attention on their mobile phones, which is a challenge. We compete not just with other news sources these days, we'll compete with people wanting to play Fortnite or betting or spending time on Instagram. I had a fascinating conversation with somebody the other week who said that our app was the only other app he used other than Tinder on his phone, and it's kind of, well... proving a lot of what the Reuters report says, I think, about where people use their mobile phone at the same time. But hopefully it's building a connection with the readers who are inspired to do something with our content or be inspired to visit again. Which brings me to what I think we need from our modern journalists, or the journalists who you hopefully are sending us into the future. They need to be data savvy. Too often we still hear trainees coming into our newsrooms talking about hits as though they're auditioning for Top of the Pops. Journalists need to show that they not only understand analytics, but also to know what to do with them. Analytics should inspire and not dictate journalism, and that's how we try to use them. And we are more than happy to work with universities to give some access to our real-time data in part of your modules, because we think it's that important that we do so. And the company we work with, Chartbeat, equally happy to do so. Very common at American J schools for that to happen. Journalists also need to show they can build an audience around their work. Our social media editors are always complaining that they find themselves being lobbied by reporters wanting their work to go on the brand's Facebook page to get an audience to it. That's brilliant. It shows the reporters care about building the audience. But equally, the most impressive journalists I work with are the ones who can show they can bring their own audiences too. Many of you will be familiar with Jennifer Williams of the Manchester Evening News. There is no other political reporter in the country capable of bringing the audience that she does to quite dry subjects. I sometimes feel a little sorry for journalists who spent a fortune on a journalism degree to learn a little bit of everything. They know video sort of, they know audio maybe, they can lay out a front page on InDesign. They're the ones who stand out are the ones who excel in an area or two, the ones who can come in and have a real impact in our newsrooms. And I mentioned before the importance of a safe journalist, the ones who not only know their Section 39 from their Section 40, but also know how to stay safe too. When do you pull out your iPhone to grab the footage and when do you duck down to avoid the riot turning on you? When is it best to post a story on Facebook and when is it best to avoid being in contempt of court? These are the modern day issues around staying safe for a journalist. And finally, and perhaps most important of all, we want our journalists to be people. One of our editors-in-chief complained recently that he was fed up with his journalists taking their coats off at the front door and also taking off any sense of localness too. Then they step inside the newsroom in some sort of bizarre Clark Kent movement as Superman with no local references. It's really important for our reporters to obviously be reporters, but it also separates us from our readers unnecessarily sometimes, and I would argue it helps exaggerate the lack of trust in journalism that so many people talk about. When we talked before about the fact that it's now acceptable to only knock on a grieving relative's front door once, as a journalist, you think that sounds like a fair compromise. As the human being on the other side of the door, you're probably thinking, what do you mean it's okay to do it once? And that's what we need to think about all the time. If a reporter can start to think like a local, they've got a fantastic head start. It's so important that they're curious about local too. One of the MEN's top performing stories yesterday was why aren't aeroplanes being used to put out the Saddleworth Moor fires? And it wasn't actually a newsline the police said they weren't going to, or the fire service said they weren't going to. It's a question people were asking. Curiosity delivered a story. If a reporter can show that they think like a local, they've got a fantastic head start. As part of our newsroom rollout this year, we did ONS data analyses of all of our towns and cities, and the reporters have all built new patches on the back of that. In some newsrooms, that means we've now got a social housing patch reporter because there are a large number of people living in council houses. In others, it means we cover buses a lot more, and some newsrooms do now have buses correspondence because for every one person getting the train, which we always write about, there are 20 people getting the bus, which we rarely write about. And that's where our audience growth is going to come from. So I guess if I want to try and spark a bit of a conversation, I should probably try and be a little bit controversial, which Hillary in particular will remember during the BBC discussions wasn't normal for me by any stretch. So here's some of the challenges that I see in what you guys do. Sometimes feel that we're having the wrong debates. So we seem to spend an awful lot of time debating whether PLCs and big business are a part of the problem for the regional press. And we can have that debate, but for me, it's a bit like arguing that the heat of the sun is killing the crops and then there's no point just staring at the sun and tutting about it. We need to, if we genuinely believe that's the problem, what's the solution? Second part here is I actually think within a profit-driven organisation is actually the safest place for local journalism, as the demise of the lower margin small publishers is starting to demonstrate. It doesn't have all the answers and it has its own problems. But we also live in a world where journalism is under attack like never before. Even in local journalism, deep pockets can be required to protect us from those who would prey on us for a quick buck through the courts. I know one multimillionaire who's trying to sue one of our newsrooms because we had the audacity of printing his address after it appeared in a planning application on the grounds that we would now be responsible if his kids get kidnapped. And we've got a choice. We can back down and take the address away from that story, or we stand up and fight it, but the fight's expensive, and there are a lot of other publishers that wouldn't be able to afford to do that. There are also those who want to use their advertising power to nullify our content. Councils in particular are very bad at this. Stripping out the profit in journalism doesn't save journalism. I think it puts it in further peril. That's just my view. But what if instead of debating the merits of something we fundamentally can't change, we actually work together on the bigger challenge that we can influence, and that's the information deficit, which I believe is as big a threat to journalism as anything else. By the information deficit, I mean the police. 20 years ago, every still saw that was stolen in Accrington would be a nib in the Lancashire Evening Telegraph. Thanks to the local sergeant. Now you're lucky if the voice bank is updated when there's a murder. Ambulance and fire. All too often, the right to call the local stations has been replaced by police-style centralisation, where a harassed on-duty manager is expected to pick and choose what should be released, or we just get referred to Twitter, because obviously they can release all the information in 140 characters. CCGs, which replaced the PCCs, and we all know they were far from perfect. They were supposedly bringing decision-making closer to people. They're utterly opaque and secretive. Then there's hospital trusts. Many now meet in secret because foundation trust rules mean that they can do. Sod the fact there are people queuing on trolleys to get into A&E. There's no accountability in the NHS so often. And then councils. The arrival of the BBC's funded local democracy reporters has led to an uptick in councils sticking stuff in part 2 so they can discuss it in secret, from the same bloody councils that was complaining about the fact that we never sent any reporters to cover their meetings in the first place. Give them a scrutiny. It's a very different story. The information deficit is what we all need to work on as industry and individuals to make sure everyone, not just those who hold the future in their hands, have a fighting chance at the future, the very people you're creating in your classrooms. So what else? Right, if I can be blunt, there's still too much in my day when I speak to people teaching the journalists of tomorrow. I suspect the very fact you guys are here means that you're probably all thinking, that's not me, and I suspect it isn't. I'm all for reminiscing over a pint, but it doesn't do students any favours when they arrive seeking work. All too often, work experience placements end with comments like, my journalism lecturer told me local newsrooms were dead, but I loved it. I did a talk earlier this year to a group of third years at a university, and one of the lecturers asked a whole bunch of questions about digital revenue in front of the room, saying a local editor who I worked with has said there was no money in digital and what was the point of doing it all. That editor had indeed said that 7 years ago. That editor is now a proud owner of a newsroom which is profitable in its own right. He has secured the future of local journalism in his city, yet information that's 7 years out of date was being presented contemporaneously to students. Digital snobbery is still a thing in some quarters. I love it when I encounter a course that puts content rather than platform at the heart of what it does, but still too often we seem to be teaching skills from newsrooms of a bygone era. Teaching digital news is our future. We shouldn't breed a snobbery about it. There have always been stories that as reporters we didn't want to write. For me, it was the Great Harwood County Show. For some of our reporters, it's probably something that's very different, very modern. It's always been part of the mix. Perhaps the most contentious point here, or even more contentious point here, is a phrase that a colleague coined a while ago, and that's the young dinosaur. 3 years in J school, sometimes they arrive with us fired up to get a front page lead. Brilliant, that's exactly what they want, but they have no interest in online. Honestly, it's still a lot more common than you think. It's also sometimes a problem with people coming from some of the other publishers to us as well. I didn't come here to write listicles and so on. It's the sort of thing that we hear. If you believe in journalism, you surely believe in the importance of deploying any trick in the book to get an audience honestly to it. So having said all that, and essentially spent the last 5 minutes offending you all, how do we work together, assuming that you want to, on the back of that? So these are some of the things that I would suggest, and you'll be pleased to know I am close to wrapping up. Come and see our newsrooms. Spend time in them. We're happy to host as many people as want to come into our newsrooms to come and see them all. They're not perfect. We don't mind you seeing the things that aren't working, because you'll probably have the ideas on how we can make them right. The vast majority of our staff are proud of what they do and they believe in where we are going. I know if you look on Hold the Front Page, you get the sense that the whole industry hates what it's doing. Talk to the vast majority of the journalists and they really do believe in where we're going, although acutely aware of the challenges we face. If something doesn't look right, ask us why we did it. The Cheltenham chip story ended up in academic studies criticising the regional press, but the author never sought out to find out why it had been written or what the impact of it was. He committed what all of us would consider to be the cardinal sin of journalism. He assumed he knew what was going on. He didn't. He looked daft within the industry as a result, but he's far from alone on that score. Very few journalists will say no to explaining their workings out when it comes to local journalism. You just need to ask. Spotting trends and what comes next is a perennial challenge for us as well, and one which is hard to get right given the speed of change and the cycles that you guys work in for your programmes. But there must be a way that we can respond to things faster. Most courses, I hope, do SEO somewhere in the programme now, but what are you doing about the fact that 20% of search is now audio-led, and how are we responding to that as well? This could be the biggest revolution that's yet to happen to the industry. Are you, as the guardians of our future leaders, in a position to help us there? And I want to finish on that point about leaders as well. This is a job ad for interns from the Washington Post. Everyone, regardless of their position, must be a leader with ideas and initiative. It used to be that companies like ours, we hired people who could learn from us. Now we aim to hire people who can teach us what we need to know. The days of people arriving raw in our newsrooms and being moulded into journalists as a formula are long gone. The stars of today are those who brought something new into the newsroom and showed it was a new worth having. How do we spot that new, and how do we make space for it to shine, either while on your courses or once they're into our newsrooms? Journalism has always been about discovering the new. Our challenge is to blend what makes journalism great with the skills that which put the audience at the heart of what we do. That's not optional, it's what our readers now expect. That, I hope, is an easier task if we find greater ways to cross the divide between the newsroom and the university. Better still, I hope, we can remove the fence that I've been banging on about for 35 minutes from our world entirely and find new ways of supporting local journalism into the future. Thank you very much.